Good evening and welcome to what's now the 35th Desmond Greaves Summer School. But before we begin, I would just ask you to remember the wife and the comrade and the cherished lifelong companion of one of our committee members, Mary O'Reilly, who tragically passed away in the early hours of Wednesday morning. She should be remembered as a lovely, committed, great person. She was an active trade unionist since she worked in Guinness's when she was young. She started off working in Guinness's, and right through to the very end she was an active member of this union, and she was a member of what the Desmond 102 branch of the union. And as some of you may have seen, the tributes that were put up from the Dublin Trades Council, and so well as paying tribute to her as a person. And the only thing I can think of, and I'd please ask you to maybe stand for a moment just to remember Mary and what she stood for. Thank you very much. Yeah. So for over 3 decades now, we're into this is the third.
I'm so sorry I'm late.
Sorry to see you.
Be here.
You're not late. We're only starting. It's good to see you. We're just doing the opening remarks. Stay where you are. Kevin's going to open the event, then I'm going to introduce you. So keep your ears nice and clean for that. Good to see you.
Nice to see you, yeah.
Thank you. I was just saying to the people that this is the 35th such school, and what we have done, tried to apply James Connolly's insights to our modern challenges. And that task has never been more urgent than today, as we witness the profound failure of the Western left to actually make any sort of stance for its constituency, what should be its constituency. And its failure to stand for national democracy, peace and independence against the assaults of transnational capital. And this unwillingness to defend sovereignty and provide real political leadership and political education has ceded ground to the right, leaving progressive forces weakened. And our work this weekend is to try and make a contribution to address that failure, and that's what we're on about. And to guide us in our task tonight, we're honoured to have Clare Daly. She's a former TD and MEP. Clare was a fearless and essential voice in both Dublin and Brussels against war, NATO expansion and the erosion of sovereignty. Her unwavering advocacy for Palestine and opposition to EU militarization exemplify the anti-imperialist solidarity which we hope this school is committed to. It is therefore a privilege to hand over the chair to her for tonight's session, where she will guide us through what we hope is a vital conversation with you, Vijay, and also when you go another element or segment of it where we'll be introducing a book or a new edition of a book by Desmond Greaves. Thank you.
For heaven's sake. Thanks very much, Kevin, and I just want to start by acknowledging the efforts of all of those who for 35 years have organised and ensured that this school, this gathering takes place. It's a wonderful achievement. It's a tribute to Desmond Greaves, his struggle as a historian, as a political activist, and it's poignant that we're here tonight when one of the key organisers of the committee has lost his partner and his wife. The only reason I'm here is that Mick O'Reilly had plagued me to be here at this important event, and I was only talking to him on Tuesday. He said he'd meet me here, and then to hear just now that Mary had passed away in her sleep on Wednesday is really hard to take. So our solidarity and our strength and the struggle carries on for Mick, for the family, and in memory of Mary. I think, as Kevin said, the session tonight is in two parts. The second part will be Dr Ruan O'Donnell will launch his re-edition of Desmond Greaves' book on Liam Mellows. We'll do that at the end. But our main man, our key player tonight is, of course, Vijay Prashad, who is coming to us to talk about the multipolar world, the opportunities and the difficulties. And what an appropriate time that this would happen against the backdrop of what is really geopolitical earthquakes taking place. Vijay, of course, is the Executive Director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. He's an internationally well-known author of many books, too numerous to mention here, but they do concentrate on the global south and the anti-imperialist struggle, and he is very well known for that. And if you haven't read his material, you should seek it out and begin to read it. I think it's appropriate to say that he's also a very good friend of the anti-imperialist activists in Ireland. He's always been incredibly generous with his time and his association with us. And in that sense, for those of you who don't know him, you're in for a treat. For those of you who do, he does go on a bit when he's left. So I have to say, I'm starting off that I'm under strict instructions that he's on a clock and we're on a clock. So I will be merciless, Vijay. But at the same time, the topic is huge. He is the best man for the job. He has written extensively about the bipolar period in the Cold War. He was, and the struggles particularly of the non-aligned movement. He heralded the disintegration of US hegemony, which is so obvious now to everybody every single day. The days of the US dominance are over. We know, of course, that they abused that position. 250 invasions or wars over 30 years. But at the same time, there was a certain stability in that situation. That is now gone. And we do have both opportunity and danger, because the transitional period is incredibly dangerous. The possibility of a militaristic, imperialist free-for-all, a lawless brawl for resources, a new Great War conflict on a dying planet that's screaming out for cooperation is a very real possibility. And we only have to look at the tragedy in Gaza, the unfolding of a live-stream genocide for almost 3 years, the barbarity being perpetuated on those people, while the so-called democratic powers not only stand by, but enable and ensure that it began and that it continues. And these are the dangerous days that we live in. So there is a vacuum. It's very clear that China feels a responsibility and an opportunity in that vacuum. We had the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting earlier last week, where China and Xi Jinping talked about the possibility of a new era of global governance. He had assembled Russia, Iran, India, the countries that probably make up the majority of the world's population. And yet we in Ireland are subjected to a media that just trumpets out Atlanticist material, totally focused on the US, the settler colonial projects of America, of Australia, of Israel, and the old colonial powers of Europe. But they are a minority in the world at the moment, and there is a struggle unfolding for a new world order. A world order, as Xi Jinping articulated it, was quite impressive. He talked about the importance of sovereignty, of the international rule of law, and the importance of putting people first. Can they do it? Is this the way forward? These are the issues that Vijay is going to introduce to us now. So I suppose to kick off and to say with great thanks to Vijay for giving up his time tonight. He has about 40 minutes to introduce, and then we will take questions and contributions from the floor. But he's going to deal with what is the multipolar world, why is it coming into being, what are the main causes or the main effects, what are the emerging poles in this situation, who are the winners and losers, and particularly how can we seize this opportunity for a world based on international law, on humanity, on decency that puts people first. So without further ado, we're absolutely delighted to have Vijay here. You're very welcome, and thanks so much.
Thanks a lot, Clare. It's really it's a dumbfounding thing to be introduced by Clare Daly, who should actually be making this presentation, as she has often made with great comic effect in the European Parliament. What else could you do there but be a comedian? Only, as they say, only the fools speak the truth, and ours is a philosophy of fools. So there, Ursula von der Leyen. So there. At least my ancestors were not Nazis. That much I can say. At least my ancestors were not Nazis. Well, okay. The first thing I'm going to do is to disavow the main category in the title, multipolar. I'm going to disavow it because these categories, unipolar, multipolar, and so on, they come from US political science. In fact, they come from physics before that, but they are brought into US political science in a way to try to define the terms of how US conventional political scientists wanted to see the world, how they wanted to capture the place of the United States in that world. Charles Krauthammer, for instance, drew the term unipolar out of some of these US political science discourses or their conversations. And Krauthammer wrote in 1991 in an issue of Foreign Affairs magazine that now with the collapse of the USSR, with the collapse of the communist state system, there is a unipolar moment. That's what Krauthammer put on the table in 1991. And over the years, as the United States started to find its own dominion challenged, people drew the obverse term from US political science, multipolar, and said, well, no, now we are entering a multipolar world. And I'm going to say, maybe it's about time we set aside the categories of US political science and try to use a different way to understand the world today. Now, before I get to that, I also want to say that it's an immense honor to speak at a gathering that looks at the legacy of Desmond Greaves. I'm, as Claire said, I've been for a very long time very much associated with and revived by the tonic of Irish republicanism and the Irish left. For a very long time, I've felt very much inspired by the Irish people. Well, one of the great publications of Professor Greaves was his book where he assembled the writing of Marx and Engels on the Irish question, showing how Marx was utterly sympathetic to the Fenian Rebellion and so on. And it's something that I've always kept in my mind, that after the Easter Rising of 1916, it was Lenin who supported the Easter Rising and it was Trotsky who opposed it. This one more point in my mind against Trotsky in my ledger that I keep of Lenin and Trotsky. Anybody who supports the Easter Rising of 1916 is good by my book. And of course, Professor Greaves' terrific biography of James Connolly, which is just a quick, beautiful read of a terrific life. So I'm really grateful to speak with you, around you, as you celebrate the immense work of a Marxist historian, an Irish Republican Marxist historian. It's a great pleasure for me to be in that company that you have assembled. So let's go back to this question of unipolarity and multipolarity. But think of it differently. When the Soviet Union did collapse and the communist state system in Eastern Europe alongside it, at that time, it did appear, and Charles Krauthammer was perhaps not alone in saying that this is a unipolar moment. I mean, the moment was so stunning that even somebody with the great erudition of Perry Anderson decided, wait a minute, we need to stop publishing New Left Review and start a new series of New Left Review. The first editorial in the new series was called Renewals, where effectively Perry Anderson almost surrendered and said the best critical thinking nowadays is right-wing thinking. And he started to, from a Marxist perspective, assess the thinking of the right. Very interesting development. So this general view that the left has been defeated and the right has come up as the leader was actually from Krauthammer all the way out to Perry Anderson. A very wide range of people were saying, not similar, but they were speaking in the same register, that the United States is triumphant at this point. Of course, there were some of us crazy people demurring at the time, saying, well, the United States is attempting hegemony, but has not secured hegemony, which is why they construct concepts like rogue state, saying Cuba, North Korea, Iran later, then Syria, and so on, were all rogue states. Why were they rogue states? Because they were not buckling to the US defined political and economic system. They were not going to accept the new World Bank, 1994. They were not going to accept the dominion of NATO over the whole world, starting with its first actual out-of-area operation against Yugoslavia in 1999. Yugoslavia was not part of the North Atlantic world system. Now people say, well, the first out-of-area operation was Afghanistan 2003. In fact, why concede Yugoslavia? Yugoslavia was never part of that worldview of NATO's planning. This is a very much out-of-area operation. If you didn't accede to the World Bank's approach to doing economics, then they're going to get bombed and you're a rogue state. So the United States kept trying to impose hegemony on the world, but was not really able to secure a quote-unquote unipolar world order. It kept trying but was not able to. I think this is an important point. I would not concede, as it were, complete defeat for the world in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. Because after all, remember, Marx says the revolution burrows under the ground. He says, well done, old mole. Well said, old mole, as you burrow your tunnels underneath, and so on. But the United States wasn't paying attention to what's happening in China. They were, in a way, a little bit, taken aback by how China was producing all these commodities, but they were not watching carefully. I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. Meanwhile, the United States pushed for a political and economic order that was unsustainable. On the one side, you had neoliberal policies where they hollowed out their own economies. Ireland experienced that early when the great tiger roared and then discovered that its roar was actually made into a vacuum. Nobody could hear it. The banks started to collapse. Icelandic banks collapsed. It was only subsequently, with the real credit crisis in 2007, that the hollowness of neoliberalism became apparent. The hollowness being that you allow your billionaires to take their money and do whatever they want with it, not invested municipally, not invested nationally, but do whatever. They can be in tax havens, they can hold it in financial markets, in hedge funds, they can invest it doing whatever they want. They are not constrained, unconstrained billionaire class. Today a report comes that Tesla might give Elon Musk a $1 trillion bonus. $1 trillion. He'll be the first trillionaire in world history. Burn them. That's what I say. That's what I say. But the United States effectively, and its Western European partners, effectively hollowed out their own societies through neoliberalism. They allowed for the hemorrhaging of their industrial base. They allowed for the deindustrialization of their own countries, the shifting of industry to the global south through subcontracting. That was called globalization. You had neoliberalism being the internal, what I think of as mismanagement of your economics, of your national finances. You're just allowing the rich no longer to pay tax. And then on a global scale, globalization, where you're deindustrializing your industrial base and basically neglecting infrastructure. If you don't have municipal or national finances, you can't invest in infrastructure. So this hollowed out society in the global north, it begins to create its own ruptures and problems, and those come to a head in the big credit crisis, financial crisis, the beginning of the Great Depression in the global north, 2007, when the banks in the United States first go under as a consequence of the housing market collapsing, and then the spill-on effects into Western Europe. And if you look at graphs of growth rates in the North Atlantic countries, all the way from Germany out to the United States, there's basically been no growth since 2007. It's spluttering along, hit even harder by the COVID-19 pandemic and then further by the war in Ukraine. There's been no real recovery of the economy. There's recovery in the stock markets, but not recovery in the overall economy. No real growth in these societies. Well, when the financial crisis hit in 2007, 2008, the real shock didn't come to the economists in the global north. I mean, it's true that I'm told the Queen of Buckingham Palace asked her economists, how did nobody know that this was going to happen? Well, they knew very well. Or at least the Marxists were yelling and screaming in their ears, you've over-leveraged your banks, you've over-leveraged your banks. The term that we were quoting at the time, you can't give ninja loans. You have average wages declining or stagnant, and yet the standard of living is improving. It's basically ninja loans that are closing the gap between aspirations of the Western consumer and stagnant wages. Ninja loans being no income, no jobs. If you have no income, no jobs, it's difficult for you to pay the mortgage on your house or to pay the interest on your loans. So the shock was not so much economists in the global north or even the managers, the Sarkozys and others. They were not utterly shocked and dismayed. This was all very much predictable. The shock, interestingly, comes to people in India, in China, in Brazil, in countries which had entirely geared their export-oriented economies to export to the North Atlantic markets. And so these countries were actually in a problem. China, for instance, was making refrigerators which can't fit in the Chinese kitchen. You know, they're giant refrigerators for the US suburban homes and for some suburban homes outside Dublin and so on. You know, those giant houses with huge kitchens where you basically have a walk-in refrigerator, you know, with 2 doors and ice machines and so on. No kitchen in Africa, Asia, except very small elite homes can have those. So these countries, these manufacturing units were in a real perplexed position. Where are we going to export our goods if the North Atlantic market is no longer going to be predictable? So they start to talk to each other and they go into the lexicon of the United Nations and uncover the terms South-South cooperation and South-South trade. And in fact, the BRICS bloc, first meeting in 2009, is a direct response to the 2007 credit crisis or financial crisis in the North Atlantic countries. And the Belt and Road Initiative from China 2013 is an even more direct reaction to that, because the Chinese are seeking new markets, new places to develop trade relations, to pivot away from the North Atlantic economy. So this pivot away starts shortly after 2007. And you see South-South trade start to increase enormously. This trade, again, is going to increase even further during the COVID pandemic, when global trade networks are disrupted and regional trade networks take up the space. And if you look at the graphs, it goes up after the Ukraine war starts, because the United States starts and Europe start to sanction Russia and other countries, and these countries begin to turn to each other for trade, so that Russia-China trade just escalates upward. China-India trade starts to increase, which is, you know, an interesting background to Narendra Modi's visit to China, to Tianjin for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting. And of course, the Russia-India trade increases quite astronomically. I'll come back to that as well in a moment. So there's an emergence first of a trade network that's South-South, that includes Brazil, and then increasingly Mexico gets involved in it a little bit, but Mexico tied to the US market much more firmly. Indonesia and most Asian countries, they are growing very fast, largely because they are yoked to the Chinese economy, which is the greatest dynamo in the world today in terms of economic growth. Well, what did the United States and the Europeans miss about China that was happening from 1991-92? They were thinking, well, it's the workshop of the world, we'll just take advantage of Chinese labor. Even Marxists in the West were writing ludicrous things saying, you know, China has given up socialism, restored capitalism, they're basically an agent. Meanwhile, the Chinese were doing something interesting. What they were doing was what no other dependent country in the third world did at any point in world history, which is why China has proven the limits of dependency theory. What the Chinese did was, firstly, there really isn't a private sector in China. That's a misnomer. In every company in China, there is a party unit at many levels, and on every board of every private company, there is a party representative. The Communist Party of China is involved fundamentally in Chinese business, in all businesses. Secondly, the Chinese government at no time permitted the capitalists in China to create themselves into a class. So in China, there is no capitalist class. There are capitalists, many of them, perhaps too many of them, but they are not allowed to form a class. In other words, just as there are workers in Europe, they are not necessarily a class for themselves. They are not organized into a class. In most countries, they don't have a party of the working class. You know, British Labour Party, that's a joke. They should suspend that name. They should call it something quite different. It's not a Labour Party at all. You know, there is no workers' party in most countries in Europe. There are no workers' parties. In the same way, Chinese capitalists not allowed to form a political organization, not allowed to own media, not allowed to control the means of having a political debate. They can't have private think tanks and foundations, for instance, to influence politicians. And it is very dangerous to try to bribe anybody. You will get executed. So the capitalists were not permitted to form a class. That I think is interesting. And interesting that this has not been picked up by Marxists. We are well aware of the distinction between class in itself, that is to say, there is a working class in every society, and class for itself, a class that is able to form itself into an active, conscious class that acts politically. That's a distinction Marx made very clearly, and I'm actually quite shocked and surprised that so many Marxists looking at China never questioned whether there was an existence of a capitalist class where there can't be private media, where there cannot be, capitalist political parties and so on and so forth. Okay, number 3 in China, the government mandated that when firms made a deal with foreign companies, they had to contractually demand that the foreign company, if they wanted to invest and build a factory in China, they had to contractually hand over the science and technology of what they were producing. So for instance, German companies in the 1990s were in the lead in the manufacturing of solar equipment, of cells, of batteries, of arrays and so on. German companies were in the lead. They were so eager for the working people of Wuhan, Hebei province with Wuhan as the capital, so eager that they signed deal after deal, transferring the technology, telling the Chinese how they do this. Then the Chinese studied this carefully. They took the science of batteries and the science of arrays, and they produced cheaper and better arrays, and today Chinese companies have completely bankrupted the German firms. German firms all rushed to the WTO, World Trade Organization, saying China has stolen our technology, and the Chinese said, but you signed a form here. It said that we can see all the science and there are no patent provisions and so on. And so there it is. This is something no third world country did. With third world countries welcomed foreign direct investment, some are believing that FDI by itself, foreign direct investment by itself, was going to engineer economic growth. In fact, what engineers economic growth is gross investment or net fixed capital, or taking the surplus that you're able to create and investing it in building infrastructure, factories and so on. And that's what the Chinese did. They were able to become the big dynamo of the global south, and they continue to be the most dynamic economy. Okay, so that's happening over here. There's this whole BRICS project, Belt and Road project and so on, South-South cooperation, because there's no certainty with the European and US markets, that they are simply not going to absorb the goods and services. Well, what does the United States and what does Europe do in response to this emerging dynamo? It says, well, if you don't surrender your growth, we are going to destroy you. I mean, what is the United States problem with China today? What is China doing that requires the US to build more and more bases in the so-called Indo-Pacific, to build the Quad, the Squad, to continue to threaten North Korea, to pressure China by building an expanded Air Force base in Darwin in Australia, where the United States is going to position nuclear carrying aircraft in violation of the Treaty of Rarotonga and so on. I mean, what is China doing that is motivating the US to be so bent out of shape, to call China a rival, a threat, and so on? What is China doing? Well, China is basically a major existential threat to the United States. And that is recognized by Elbridge Colby, who is Trump's #1 advisor on China. Mr. Colby, whose grandfather was the head of the CIA in the 1980s. Some of you may remember William Colby. His grandson now is Trump's principal advisor on China. Elbridge Colby understands the situation with crystal clarity. He wrote a very good book for Yale University Press. He understands the situation. He takes the absolutely opposite position I would, based on his reading. His reading is that the Chinese economy is going to outclass, and maybe already is outclassing, the US hegemony or control over science and technology, particularly in the most advanced areas of science, which include things like transportation, communication, then specialized areas like cameras, magnets, and so on, that the Chinese are way ahead of the United States in these areas of development. If the United States is going to remain the preeminent power in the world, Mr. Colby says, China has to be stopped. And how can China be stopped? Well, the United States should threaten China and tell them to stop advancing their development. Simple as that. Now here's the interesting thing, that this is actually something the United States has done before. It did this before with Japan. When Japan was, going gangbusters with cars, with computers, with cameras and so on in the 1980s and 90s, the United States under Bill Clinton went to the Japanese government and said, you have to reverse the strength of the yen against the dollar. And so the Japanese surrendered and signed the Plaza Accord in 1985. And then 10 years later, in 95, when Clinton was there, they signed the Reverse Plaza Accord. In 2009, when the government of Mr. Hatoyama, newly elected government of Mr. Hatoyama, Prime Minister of Japan, when Mr. Hatoyama said that we want the United States to no longer expand its bases in Okinawa and perhaps leave, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama go to Japan and they force the removal of that government. It's a very interesting, soft coup d'etat against an elected government in Japan. Very little reported in 2009. So Japanese have thrice been humiliated by the United States in the Plaza Accord, the Reverse Plaza Accord, and then the removal of Hatoyama in 2009. The Chinese, incidentally, understand all this, and they say pretty openly that, sorry, we will not return to the century of humiliation. They use that term, meaning from the Opium War, First Opium War, till the victory of the Chinese Revolution, from 1842 to 1949, the century of humiliation, we are not going to return to it. Very straightforward. And therefore, coming to my final point, the Chinese are not interested in, nor is the other Indians, nor other Russians, I think, but Russians I'm less certain about. Chinese and Indians for sure are not interested in a multipolar world, even if they may use the term casually. They don't want a world with many poles. Because after all, the world before the Great War of 1914 was also a multipolar war. There was the Ottoman pole, the Tsarist pole, the German Kaiser's pole, the British pole, the American pole, and they went to war. The Chinese argue not for a multipolar world, but for a multilateral world. A world where the United Nations and its charter dominate international discourse. They would like a world with no poles. And Xi Jinping has said this many times. China does not want to become a hegemon. China does not want to become a hegemon even in Asia. Not interested. China would like a multilateral world, a world of international law, where the UN Charter, which is the greatest consensus document ever signed in the world, will finally be taken seriously. And so, taking that point, let's come to the September 3rd parade in Beijing. There was Trump, there was Putin, there was Kim Jong-un, there was Mr. Xi Jinping, and a range of other leaders, including Miguel Diaz-Canel Bermudez from Cuba, and so on. all of them right there in Tiananmen Square, and there was a big military parade. At one level, as Mr. Trump saw it with his Truth Social tweet, as Mr. Trump saw it, this was an aggressive military posture saying, we'll take you on and so on. Actually, not at all. That is not what Mr. Xi Jinping said in his speech, because I don't think they listened to him carefully. That's not what he did when he walked into the Great Palace to observe the parade. When he walked into the palace with Putin and Kim Jong-un, they met veterans of the anti-fascist war, and they embraced them. You see, we are publishing a report from Tricontinental in a few weeks, and I really hope the Desmond Greaves School will circulate it. But what we found in our research in preparation for this period of the 80th anniversary of the anti-fascist commemoration, we looked at all the numbers of war dead, and it's actually stunning. The war in Asia, World War II, starts in 1937 with the Marco Polo Bridge incident, and it ends either in 1945, September 3rd, when Japan surrenders, but then the United States continues to arm the Kuomintang, so you can legitimately say the war goes on till 1949 with the Chinese Revolution, but then the United States enters the Korean conflict. Remember, you have the Korean conflict starting, which has an armistice in about 53-54. That war has never really ended. So you could say legitimately that the Second World War in Asia starts in 1937 and goes till 1953-54. It's the longest sector of World War II. Even if you just take from 37 to 45, that's 2 years longer than the war in Europe. And the United States only enters the war in 1941. We look at the numbers. 50 million Soviet citizens and Chinese patriots and communists died to defeat fascism. 50 million. Okay, that is an unbelievable number. Nothing near that from Western Europe and from the United States. Nothing near that. In fact, most people don't even know that Asian soldiers and African soldiers fought in Europe. My grandfather fought in Italy, for instance. I lost 2 uncles in the French sector. They were part of the colonial army. Yeah, nobody really knows much about all that. But forget them. Family members fought in Burma as well, with Wingate Chindits and so on. Yeah, in the Burmese sector. 50 million Soviet citizens, Chinese communists and Chinese patriots died. 80% of the Wehrmacht was destroyed by the Soviet Red Army. 80%. All these films that showed Tom Hanks and other Iowa boys landing on the Normandy beaches, they didn't defeat fascism. What Xi Jinping said in Tiananmen Square on the 3rd of September was that we know what it meant to fight for freedom and for our revolution. We know what it took. It took immense sacrifices. We don't want a war. We want peace and development. You want war and austerity, but we want peace and development. We have sacrificed enough to build a world of peace and development. We don't want war and austerity. That's the message of multilateralism. That's the message coming from Beijing now. That is exactly what the Indian foreign minister said when he said, we don't agree with the NATO mindset. In other words, we don't agree with a world of camps, this camp here, that camp there. We want to establish humanity, not multipolarity. We want humanity. We want one world under the UN Charter. Is that so much to ask for? Thanks a lot.
That was absolutely amazing, Vijay. Thank you so much. And I can't believe how disciplined you were. That is really very strange. But in any case, how long have you got with us? How long can you stay with us? You're at our disposal. Perfect. I don't know if people are ready to interject, but I think Vijay touched on a huge number of issues there in the discussion. I think for me it was very pertinent, and I think he framed it really well, that we here are exposed constantly, not just through the Irish Times and RTE, but through an Atlanticist viewpoint of the world, when the majority of the world's humanity lives outside of that space and is organising and trying to find a better way forward. And I think that's something that we should capitalise on. I mean, there were so many issues, I can tease them out for you, but if there are people who want to ask questions of Vijay, I think we should do that now. But there's some very interesting points about China itself, about the role of the European Union, who in this era of the possibility of, as Vijay correctly says, multilateralism rather than multipolarity, a defence of the UN Charter, a defence of international law. But Europe, against that backdrop, had the opportunity and has the opportunity to side with that, but is instead rowing in behind at an enormous cost in terms, for all of our people, in terms of rising behind the military demands of the US and are economically subservient as well. I mean, it's completely lunacy. They have broken links with Russia, decoupled from China. I mean, we had even Leo Varadkar here when he was Taoiseach talking about Ireland needed to de-risk from China. But actually trade from Ireland, we benefit much more from our dealings with the Chinese than they do with us. What are we de-risking from? So these issues are incredibly important because they touch on the future of our security as well, because while it's very true, as Vijay said, the soundings coming out from the South-South are very good. The calls for humanity, for a non-great power conflict, but at the same time there's a dynamic developing around the NATO members or so that are pushing in the direction of increased militarization. And we've seen a rise in military spending from the Chinese. They haven't been aggressive, they haven't provoked anything anywhere, but they have responded to the Western impetus in that, and global military spending now is off the Richter scale, when actually the world's resources should be spent on dealing with the climate change crisis. So are there any people ready to ask Vijay a question or to make a comment? Yeah, fire away.
One thing I'd like to ask Vijay is in relation to the United States and the UK.
Can you hear that, Vijay?
Can you hear me?
He's muted.
You're muted.
Yeah, he's muted. Has he muted himself?
I didn't get your name.
Okay.
My
You should
name
give
is
her name.
Beryl Ryan. What I wanted to ask you, Vijay, was what you thought of the grip that Israel is having currently on the United States and the UK. For example, all the politicians nearly in the US have their AIPAC man, their Israeli man, and the head of the Columbian University who got the police in to remove the students on the Gaza protest has now been appointed economic advisor to Keir Starmer, was brought over by David Lammy over to the UK. And just in relation to all of that, the statistics that I have in Keir Starmer, when he was being, first of all, Trump got $1 million from the Israelis for his election, and the prior one, he got $1 million to push the embassy, the US embassy, into Jerusalem. So that was another 100 million. Keir Starmer got 50,000 from pro-Israeli millionaire Trevor Chin, Home Secretary Yvette Cooper, 210,000 from pro-Israeli businessman Gary Lubner. Foreign Secretary David Lammy received 70,000 from pro-Israeli businessman Gary Lubner, again appears. Chancellor of the Exchequer Rachel Reeves, 64,000 for Gary Lubner again, and 34,000 from Trevor Chin. They're the two main Israelis that are supplying the British cabinet with money for their elections. The same thing is happening in the States. So I'd just like to ask you, how do you think this type of thing happening is going to affect but you're talking about the global thing and the position of the United States and UK, etc.
Do you hear that, Vijay, yeah?
Yeah, great question. How do you want to do this, Claire? We take a few questions or?
No, you can take that one now, and then as you're answering that one, they can put their hands up.
Okay.
Yeah. So anybody else who wants to ask, yeah. Yeah, so do that one now, yeah.
Okay, so that's a great question. I really appreciate it. And the thing is, firstly, that these politicians are really cheap. I mean, I always tell people, if you're going to take a bribe, take a good bribe. You know, taking 10,000 pounds, 50,000, what is that? That's nothing. Yeah? If you're going to support a genocide, make sure you're getting paid well. I mean, it is a genocide, you know. I mean, for God's sake, like, taking 100,000 pounds for a genocide, what kind of dignity do you have? So, if you want to bribe, I need a really good bride to be bride. Many years ago, my aunt, who's a communist in India, when I got involved in the movement, she said to me, she said, son, what's your price? You got to know your price. You know, if you're going to be in this movement, you got to know your price. You got to know they're going to come after you and they're going to hit you hard and they're going to, try to get you with money and they're going to try to get you with scaring you and so on. You have to be ready. You have to have a price in your head. So I have my own price. I won't tell you, but it's a very high price. These guys they don't need the money to be Zionists. You know, it's not like David Lammy or Trump are supporting Israel like this because some jackass gave them a little bit of money. That's misleading. That's not how it works. They are getting the money because they are Zionists. They are not doing this at the bidding of the Zionists, if you know what I mean. They are already Zionists. Why are they Zionists? They are Zionists because most of them are, in a sense, colonial white supremacists. That's the problem with the governments in the North Atlantic. Instinctively, people who get elected believe that their countries are better than every country in the world. That in fact, the Palestinians are savages, by and large, yeah? That, Hamas, it's a savage organization. I mean, this idea that the Israelis should be in Eurovision or play in the European Football League is indicative of a disease inside the European imagination, which is a disease called racism. That's as simple as that. The Palestinians are animals. The Israelis are people. It's what I think of as an international division of humanity. People who say, there's gas off the coast of Gaza, that's why they're doing this. Give it up, guys. There's not always economic reasons for doing things. There are also old colonial hang-ups, You would prefer that part of the world where Jesus Christ comes from to be in European hands. My God, that goes back to the first crusade. Get the Muslims out of there. Let's control. These are motives that we should not underestimate. There are motives of racism operating. This idea that there's a person who wrote an article that I read recently saying, the children who are starving to death in Gaza, well, those are unfortunate things happening, but they had pre-existing conditions. I mean, that's something that an American writer writes and an American journal publishes. I mean, that's astounding, in our time, that somebody basically says, well, let them die. Okay, let's take that logic back to medicine and the concept of pre-existing conditions. Okay, so people who died during the pandemic, they had pre-existing conditions. Sorry, people, you died. What kind of logic is that? That's not a logic. That's genocidal thinking. Yeah, I mean, the fact that the British government provided surveillance flights for the targeted destruction of entire civilian neighborhoods in Gaza, and that to a so-called social democratic government or whatever the hell they call themselves. Yeah? I mean, what's the difference between Nigel Farage and Keir Starmer if you're Palestinian?
No, very little.
Thank you, Vijay. Okay, I'll take the two of you, so the two of you, Emmett and then yourself. Yeah.
Sorry, Emmett Farrell's my name. That was a very impressive contribution.
Can you hear Vijay?
Yeah.
Yeah, just in relation to your own writing, Patrick Bond in South Africa has criticised the approach in relation to, he's written a book called Walking Left, Talking Right, about the BRICS. And the point he makes is in relation to Israel. South Africa is the biggest coal contributor to South Africa, has been for 2 years now, since October the 7th. China is a very, very big trade with Israel, and so on. So maybe could you comment on that, because I found that argument, you don't see that argument very much.
Very good. And we're going to take 3 questions here now, Vijay, yeah?
Hello, Vijay. Michael Quinn is my name. Vijay, could you comment on the suggestion put forward that the present status of the war between Ukraine and Russia and the way the Russians are conducting the war and the way the Western powers are reacting to the war is actually accelerating this multilateral trend across the globe? Would you say that's correct?
Very good.
Tom Crilly, I'd like to know what's going on in Pakistan. At one time they get rid of Imran Khan, who seemed to be taking on an anti-imperialist type role, and now he seems to be wanting to be part of friendly with the global south and India maybe, or maybe China and the whole, and anti-Israel. But what is going on in Pakistan?
Well, I have to say, these are incredibly good questions. Normally at left-wing meetings in Ireland, you don't actually get questions. You get people giving commentary, and they don't ask a question. But these were succinct and brilliant. I thought they were all excellent. So if you can deal with the 3 of them, Vijay, that would be amazing. You can take a little bit of time, because I think all of the 3 of them touched on some really important issues.
Well, in fact, they are very similar in one respect, because they come to the question of how you see the world. In other words, your epistemology, your system of knowledge. You see, I live in Santiago in Chile, and if I come out of my apartment and I have to walk to my office, it's about 15 minutes walk, I have maybe 5 or 6 different routes that I can take, and none of the routes are straight lines. History doesn't move in straight lines. History is very complicated, and that is why from Marx and that tradition we develop our thinking not to be analytical philosophers but to be dialecticians. Sometimes Patrick is a little too much of an analytical philosopher. He sees things from the standpoint of perfection. Why isn't everybody behaving as if all the roads are straight and all the corners are at right angles? Why isn't everything about the BRICS lining up, with a certain theory that says BRICS is anti-imperialist? You see, I didn't say in this presentation that BRICS was anti-imperialist. I explained that it emerges out of a concern, economic concern, the decline of the Western markets and so on, and then it emerges out of worry that the United States would punish them for trading with each other, and that point was proved by Trump saying, if you join the BRICS, we will sanction you, But no point have I personally ever said that the BRICS is anti-imperialist. So if you start from the standpoint of saying, no, you are wrong, the BRICS is not anti-imperialist, you first erected a straw man, and then you would like to see history move perfectly, like all the characters who are black in my chessboard must all move at the same pace in the same way, and we must defeat the other side in a way that is without contradictions. Well, history doesn't move like that, sorry. And this is part of my problem with the ultra-left, who don't understand the role of contradictions in history. They seek perfection in the world. In that sense, they have a Jesuitic personality. They believe too much in the greatness of Christ and the purity of Mary. And Christ was not all great and pure. Mary was not all pure. So relax. History moves in As Engels said, history moves in zigs and zags. And our role as Marxists is to track the actual movement of history, not our preferred movement of history, and develop strategy and tactics based on the actual movement of history. So that's what I would answer to Patrick. And I mean, it's a little frustrating that he frequently comes on television shows and basically attacks me saying he's saying that BRICS is anti-imperialist. Well, you know, he can say whatever he wants. He's entitled to. After all, he is American. He can say whatever he wants. But I mean, I've never said that BRICS is anti-imperialist. So let's have a factual conversation. Now, the question of oil and so on to Israel is a very fraught question. I think the Colombian government under Gustavo Petro took the very good stand after 1 year of selling coal or allowing private coal companies to sell coal to Israel. He banned it. He took the decision that the government is not going to permit. A very good decision. South African coal producers took up the slack. In a sense, to expect Cyril Ramaphosa to ban private business is, I think, a fantasy. Okay, Ramaphosa went so far. He backed his foreign minister, Nelly Pandor at the time, to take the case of genocide to The Hague. I salute Ramaphosa for that. He walked up to here. He zigged with us. And then on the issue of interfering with quote-unquote private business, he zags back and says that I can't interfere with private business. Okay, now because he zagged, do you say the zig was false? No, you take what you get. That's what politics is about. You think Clare is sitting in the European Parliament saying, look, this person believes what I believe, but I don't agree with the other thing, so I'm not going to stand with them. Sometimes you make all kinds of alliances. South Africa is ruled by a right-of-center government. Who are we kidding? It's an alliance with the Democratic Alliance, a right-wing political party, pro-imperialist political party. You can't expect the ANC Democratic Alliance government to take every position like we would take. But they certainly zigged in the direction of The Hague. That they zag on this, to me, is what life is about. Okay, we fight them on it. But we don't say, oh, you are a hypocrite. They are not hypocrites. They are doing exactly what I would expect them to do, actually. Okay, and that to me is enough for me. When it comes to, and I like these questions because in a way they are all related. When it comes to the Ukraine-Russia war accelerating multilateralism, of course it does. And remember I said I'll explain the oil business later. This is where I'll explain it. You see, Russia is able to provide cut price oil to countries around the world because it can sell unlimited amounts of oil. I mean, that's what they are doing. They are selling discounted oil to India. Now, India has refineries that were built in the time of the Soviet Union. These refineries were built with Soviet engineers. They were built with Russian crude oil levels in mind. So they are perfectly calibrated to Russian oil. India imports Russian oil at quantities greater than it needs, refines it and sells it to whom? To Europe. And makes money on the sale. So India, which has hundreds of millions of poor people, is not going to stop buying discounted oil from Russia, and secondly is not going to stop selling refined oil to the Europeans for more money because India needs it. So the Indian bourgeoisie, despite the fact you have a right-wing government in India which its own disposition is pro-US, in other words, here's the opposite of the South African story. In South Africa, they zigged to The Hague and zagged back to selling coal to Israel. In India, they zigged to the US to join this or that alliance, with this, and they zagged by saying we're not going to stop buying Russian oil. Now are you going to say India is a hypocritical country? History is contradictory, friends. If you don't have a sense of dialectics and contradiction, You don't understand how all these things can happen at the same time. So India, therefore, gets tariffed by Trump, and Modi goes to Tianjin and embraces Putin and Xi Jinping. And for the first time in 7 years makes the trip and increases the number of visas between India and China. I applaud that. I hate Modi. I'm against Modi, but I'm glad that happened. And that's the increase of multilateralism as a consequence of the war in Ukraine, but also another example of zigzag in the opposite direction. I don't see Patrick complaining about that. Never seen an article by him saying, why is India doing this? They should stop buying oil from Russia because that is, against the right wing. So there the book is, talking right, walking left. Should that be volume 2? Talk right, walk left? I mean, I don't know. Okay, Pakistan. This is again very interestingly related. Imran Khan was an amazing cricketer. By the way, I would like to say I write a monthly cricket column. That is the most popular thing. That's the most popular thing I write. It gets millions of readers every month. Nobody in Ireland publishes these columns. I don't know why no publication has taken it, but it's published in Australia, in India. In India, it's published in 8 languages. My last column was about the final test between India and England, and how India salvaged that test remarkably, and the genius of Mohammad Siraj. The previous one is about the incredible batting of Smriti Mandana, who opens the batting for the Indian women's team. She's probably the best opening batsman in the world, men and women combined. Incredible cover drives. Anyway, Imran Khan was an incredible cricketer, hugely popular man. Initially, when he first entered politics, the military embraced him. He was the military's guy. The military always needs civilians in Pakistan because it's a military society like Egypt. It's a military society. It's not a civilian society. The military dominates society. So Imran was their guy, and then Imran turned against the military, particularly with the drone strikes in northern Waziristan, where Imran said the Pakistani military is allowing the Americans to kill Pakistanis. Outrageous. We are against that. And he started to move away from the United States, which meant also from the Pakistani military. This was inexcusable, and to make room for himself, he moved towards the Chinese and then the Russians, thinking this will give him space. Unfortunately, gave him a lot of space in his jail cell, where he is now permanently located. And the Pakistani government now is totally a military government. But here comes the India-Pakistan air war of one day, when the Pakistani military saw that the Chinese systems that they were able to get from China, including the J-class fighter planes and the Chinese radar and so on, outclassed the Rafale French fighter planes that India has, outclassed India's US and Israeli radar jamming systems, and outclassed India's air defense systems. The Pakistani military is in a conundrum now. They are pro-US instinctively, but their hardware is all Chinese. And they know that without Chinese backing, they will be in trouble. And as India and China starts to get closer, Pakistan is running to maintain their closeness to China, which is why the entire Pakistani delegation showed up at the September 3rd parade. It's very much in flux in Pakistan, as it often is. But it was very hard again to make a strong point about, talking right, walking right, or talking left, walking left. That framework just doesn't work for a conjunctural analysis of history.
Anyone else, right? Yeah. There's so many issues there. I want to sort of, okay, I'm going to take 3, starting with you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Terry Glavin is my name, Vijay. I'm more interested in the European Union's aspect of whether it's multilateralism or a UN-run system. I'm very concerned. I mean, you mentioned about the Chinese and Russian losses during the prolonged Second World War, in excess of 50 million combined. Callous, the European I don't know,
High
Dunn's.
representative.
Yeah, she's absolutely useless, but she spoke to people and was saying basically that this is some sort of an unheard of history. I mean, if we have people like that, that represents me as an Irish person, I'm really troubled, and I'm wondering what you're thinking about this European Union kind of aspect of things, that senior people, so many of them unelected in the overall sense, can speak like that and can turn around and ban press TV, Ripley, Russia Today, CGTN from China. I mean, how can we ultimately ever change that?
Sorry?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, very good, and very relevant, because in these days of sanctions against Russia, a lot of the sanctions against Russia that the European Union has put in the latter rounds have been actually against European Union citizens for pro-Palestine activity, and the logic behind that was, well, they were destabilising Europe, so therefore that's what Russia wants, so therefore they must be pro-Russian and working for Russian, even though it was for Palestinian activity. So lunatic stuff. So bag that one. I'm going to take two others, Con and then yourself. Yeah.
Can you, Vijay, can you give us the answer? Can you give us what's going on in Venezuela and Marco Rubio?
Very good. Geez, you're going around the whole world, Vijay. Fair play. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to commend you for mentioning Yugoslavia, the war in Yugoslavia. That's very important. You made a very important part. And the reason why I rise to mention that is that when that happened, there was a meeting in this room of people who were opposed to what was going on. And the late Tomas McGillis said, how dare the Americans bomb a European city? And that's what happened at that time. That's all I want to say. Thank you.
No, it's a very good comment, and I would certainly agree with your point that this is in some ways still largely unspoken period where international law was initially bonfired in a way in which led the basis to everything else. So I'll take, so that wasn't a question, I'll take two more, yourself and then yourself. Yeah.
Yeah. Paul Gillespie is my name. I'm very interested in your critique of the multipolar idea, but how do you explain the popularity of the term around the emerging centres of power, other than the Western, American, European types of power, where it is popular in academic, analytical, political circles? You say that you would substitute the term multilateral for it. It seems to me the multilateral term is more a relational issue, and it's full of irony that they should, and she should, of course, be able to use the term, it having been appropriated by the unipolar powers, if you like, now. I think there may be more utility in the term multipolar perhaps than you allow. In this setting, it's not perfect, but it contains some elements of good description about what's happening in the world. Shift of power settings.
Interesting point. Okay, and then yourself, and then I'll get Vijay back in. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask, do you think that the effectiveness of colour revolutions is declining? And what I have in mind with that question is European Union's efforts in Georgia and Belarus, where their efforts haven't succeeded in gaining the traditional kind of traction that they'd expect for regime change. And is that due to the decline in power, the declining influence of soft power, or is it just the case that states are becoming, I suppose, more cynical and more effective at defending themselves from outside intervention?
Very good questions, and you've got a tour of the world, Vijay, so go for it. Yeah.
Well, let's start with Venezuela, because I just published a piece on it, because I've been in Tricontinental. We are doing a project on drugs and the drug trade and the role of drug finance. How in fact the so-called legitimate economic or financial system is completely saturated with drug money. Hundreds of billions of drug money laundered every year, maybe up to 700 billion or laundered, and that's just the known number that the UN bandies about. I believe it's much higher than that. There's a great example of HSBC. You know, it starts as a drug bank because it starts as a drug bank in the opium trade in Hong Kong, Shanghai, and then was busted for laundering narco money in Mexico. And that's one of the biggest fines paid in world financial things. HSBC's fine in Mexico. Anyway, it's because we're looking at that, I've been very interested in the drug economy and read the US government's Drug Enforcement Agency reports annually. I go through them pretty carefully because I'm very interested in how they shape the perception of the war on drugs. Okay, so what is happening in Venezuela? First, amazingly, the US government State Department raises the bounty on Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, from 25 million to 50 million. Okay, fine. I don't know, how many of you read the bounty letter?
No.
Yeah, so it was worth reading.
Yeah, narco-terrorism.
It was worth reading because, this is what I do, this kind of ridiculous things. I say, well, that's interesting, let's read the original. So I went and read it, and it suggests that Mr. Maduro is the head of a cartel, and the cartel is called Cartel de los Sol, which is Cartel of the Suns. Now, I haven't heard that phrase in over 10 years. So I was very interested, and I know, because I've looked into this before, that Cartel de los Sols is a term used first, ironically, in 1993 by a Venezuelan journalist. This is now 6 years before Hugo Chavez comes to office as president of Venezuela, because two high-ranking Venezuelan officials in 1992-93 were charged with offenses of narco-trafficking. And because in the Venezuelan military, on the side of their uniform, they have a sun, this journalist, just for fun, frivolously, called these two guys the Cartel of the Suns. And that was the first mention of this phrase. Then, after Hugo Chavez dies in 2013, two Miami-based Venezuelan journalists write hit books against Nicolas Maduro, who was just trying to win his first election as president. They published these hit books from Miami, basically accusing Mr. Maduro of being the head of the Cartel of the Suns, which doesn't exist, and saying that he is running an operation through the military, etc., etc. After those books basically flopped, the term reappears in 2025, 11 years later, now, with this accusation and the 10 to 50 million bounty. So, let's go to the experts. Who are the experts? The UN Office on Drugs and Crime, very good annual reports. The Drug Enforcement Agency of the United States, very good annual reports. I've read almost all of them, and in the reports, all of them concede that 80% of drug traffic from South America goes to the United States from the Pacific coast. They leave Guayaquil and other ports in Ecuador and Peru. They go to Mexico, and then from Mexico either overland by air or by water to California, to New Mexico and Arizona. That's how they end, 80%. About 20% from the Caribbean. And almost 0% from Venezuela. This is the Drug Enforcement Agency's reports. Almost 0% from Venezuela. Most cocaine, most opium, most marijuana comes from Colombia, comes from Mexico, comes from Honduras, and so on. I was just in Honduras, drove through an area where it was basically between coffee and marijuana. That's where the drugs come from. It does not come from Venezuela. That's the Drug Enforcement Agency. So suddenly, the Al-Qaeda of the Caribbean is the Cartel de los Sols, and another gang which was formed in a Venezuelan prison called Tren de Aragua. Okay, Tren de Aragua is most likely not even in place. It was led by a real tough guy called Nino Guerrero, who nobody knows where he is. He may be living down the road from me in Chile. The Chilean government has a warrant for his arrest. Nobody knows where Nino Guerrero is. But the Al-Qaeda of the Caribbean is Tren de Aragua and is Cartel de los Sol, and the Bin Laden of the whole thing is Maduro. And so then the United States sends 7 warships and a nuclear submarine to sit on the water's edge of Venezuela, and a boat with 11 people on it, but what looked to me like a Boston whaler, a fishing boat, open fishing boat, was targeted and brought down by a US strike. Now, the Venezuelans say it's an AI image. I don't even care whether it's AI or not AI. The fact is, if I am a drug runner with a cigarette boat trying to cross the Caribbean, it's an idiotic way to cross the Caribbean, I would not take 11 people on the boat. I would just be 2 people and fill the damn thing with cocaine. Why would you have 11? Yeah, it makes no sense. But here's the funny thing about your media. They are idiotic. They are an idiotic media. And here's the interesting thing. When you ask, there's mediocre leaders in the European Union, you have mediocre intellectuals. I mean, where is the European Hegel and Jean-Paul Sartre? Your intellectuals are mediocre. Where is the Desmond Greaves of this generation? They are too busy worrying about job security, and where are the courageous writers? And they don't exist in Europe. Europe is not producing new ideas. It's not producing challenging intellectuals. It's mediocre. Your continent has gone from a renaissance, from a bloody enlightenment to disenlightenment. Look at Germany. You can't say a word in Germany without getting arrested. It's a disenlightenment. I would call this period the disenlightenment of Europe. And that's whether it's journalists, intellectuals, leaders, or whatever. Yeah, it doesn't matter. Now, on the question of color revolutions and so on, I'm not a big believer in this phrase, by the way. I don't like it because it confuses people on the left. Because we don't know how to react when there's actually a movement of people against the government. I've heard people say all kinds of outlandish things, that, what happened in Sudan in 2019 against Umar al-Bashir was a color revolution. No, it was not a color revolution. Our comrades from the Communist Party of Sudan, from the Teachers Union, were on the street fighting against the Bashir government. Are you crazy? Color revolution. This phrase is very disorienting. It doesn't have a class character to it. It assumes that there's going to be CIA intervention anytime people come on the street. We have to have a much more specific, detailed class orientation to uprisings. You see, was the revolution in Iran in 1979 a color revolution? Is every time people go on the street, do we suspect the CIA there? We have to also have a very good sense of what's going on the ground. We shouldn't quickly come up with slogans. I'm very much opposed to categories that blunt critical thinking. So I have a problem with the term, but now let's go to the exact issue in play. It is actually not true that the fact of the rising nature of other powers has blunted the CIA and other US interventions and operations. I don't think that's the case. I live in Latin America, I can tell you. Those jokers are everywhere. There was a coup against the Bolivian government in 2019. God knows what they've been doing in Bolivia. Perhaps, whispering in the ears of Evo and Arce and others to break them all apart and disrupt them. I don't have any idea, okay? I don't have any information. I would like to know more about what happened there. But I can tell you, they are all over the place. When I opened my office in Santiago, within the week, there was an American guy on the street saying, "Oh, nice to see you. I didn't know you had moved to Santiago." I was like, "How did you even know my office is here?" Yeah, these people are there everywhere. I'm going to a certain Middle Eastern country next week. I'm going to tell you, it's going to be an interesting, we're going to meet some interesting people in the places I'm going. You never know who shows up, yeah? They are everywhere. I don't minimize their danger and so on. But I also want to caution us that there are people's movements in many of these very countries, that are fighting even sometimes against our own people, against governments that I support, and we have to figure out how to engage them. I've seen protests in countries. I thought the way the Cuban government dealt with the unrest in July 3-4 years ago was superb. Miguel Diaz-Canel got into his car, drove to the town where there was a protest, walked among the people and said, look, we are facing a serious crisis. And people said, okay, we agree with you, and went back home. Because they were disgruntled. They are finding it hard to survive. The sanctions are killing everyday life and so on. And rather than him sitting in the presidential house and saying this is a CIA plot, he went among the people and talked to them and said, no, let me explain. I thought that's the best attitude for our people to do in a case like that. But I see somebody really wants to say something.
A few people are going to have to be disciplined now. I'm going to take the last indications, okay?
I read the English Guardian online. They keep asking for money to support me because they're objective. I read their accounts of what happened in the military parade and at Shanghai, and it was pure Atlanticist propaganda. I only learned tonight that there was a large Pakistani delegation. It was all about Xi and Kim and Putin. The presence, who the other 20 leaders were, I don't know. It was all about the West's enemies getting together to clap each other on the back. And you couldn't read it any other way. And they're still asking me for money for objective journalism. Being slightly to the left of Dr. Goebbels is not objectivity, Have you any comment on that kind of media issue? Is there a trustworthy liberal on earth, basically?
That should be a short answer. Okay, I'm taking the last contributions now from people. So yourself, and then yourself, and then you. Yeah.
Just a comment from me. It was just to second something you said yourself, that we're steeped in kind of an anti-Asian, anti-Russian kind of mindset here. In the early 2000s, when the Chinese state visit came here of Zhu Rongji, the premier of Zhu Rongji, we were honoured with the Chinese state visit. I was working for Friends of the Earth at the time. My boss asked me, he said, we've got this Free Tibet banner has arrived from, I think it was Brussels, and we were asked to display it as a protest at the state banquet up in Dublin Castle. And so I was asked to organise with a group and display the banner Free Tibet. And I knew nothing about Tibet. And I said, okay, I'll do that, yeah. And I went up with the banner and the gangway, and we kind of had to push a bit because the Chinese were there before us. The Chinese residents here were there before us. And we got a spot for it anyway. And then we moved, to get a better spot, we moved across the street. And the other people that were there, they kind of, it was a bit of pushing, it was a bit awkward, it was a bit tense. And, but actually, somebody intervened and said, no, let them put out their banner. And so we displayed our banner Free Tibet. And all the bus coaches and limos and everything were coming into Dublin Castle. And it was only about two years afterwards that I learned anything about Tibet. It was very hard to get any information about it. And it was when Kevin Cale published a book, Who Owns the Earth, which is a comprehensive guide to the land ownership and land monopoly around the planet. And he described Tibet in the 1950s when China actually intervened in Tibet. He said it was mired in medieval colonialism, or feudalism, medieval feudalism. And that confirmed to me. He said the land ownership, Kevin Cale, who is no Marxist, he'd be a researcher for the Sunday Times rich list and everything, and a parliamentary researcher in the UK. great writer, but he confirmed that it was that the intervention was most welcome for the Chinese people, in fact. And, that's all. Just to say that we're brainwashed by RTE.
Oh, we certainly are. And the Irish Times. You don't want to come in, you just tell me to hurry up.
I'm afraid we have to be up by 10.
We had by 9, don't worry about it.
He said at the very start that Lenin was in favour of the Easter Rising and that Trotsky was against.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious as to why. Could Trotsky see the Irish were going to be Palestinians or something? Could he see that far ahead? The other thing is, Britain and France are going to recognise Palestine in a few weeks' time, as if it's some huge thing. I can't see much that it will do. They have taken so much land. I can't see the two-state solution. Yet we all keep trotting it out. I'm just curious what he thinks. I mean, will it do anything? I can't see it.
Okay, I think that's a wrap on the questions. Okay, Vijay, that's your last questions for now, yeah?
For now.
Okay, first I would just commend you to go and read On the Events in Dublin 1916 by Leon Trotsky. Make up your own mind. Far be it for me to try to explain. It's beyond my capacity, to be honest. It's interesting. When I meet people from Tibet who are, obviously I grew up in India, there are lots of Tibetan people in India. I often understand very much their point of view. I mean, they come from sections of Tibetan society that benefited from the Lama rule, many of them. The Lamas ruled like feudal autocrats in Tibet, and there were sections of society that genuinely benefited, and they were made into exiles, and it's a rotten thing for them. It's like going and talking to Cubans in Miami. I mean, I feel for them. I'm really sorry that you lost your big house and you had slaves and things like that. You obviously you're upset about that. It's your class perspective. That's why I don't feel they need to be paid to believe that. They had some class defeats, and the class defeat takes a toll. So 3-4 generations down the way, they are still flying a free Tibet flag. That's understandable that they would. They want to retrieve. I mean, for God's sake, the son of the Shah of Iran wants to go back and become the Shah again. He lives in Los Angeles, So these kind of characters will always be there. But we also need a class perspective, for God's sake. This is part of the problem with identity politics. There's no such thing as being a Tibetan. They are Tibetan elites from the Lama's autocracy. This identity politics thing is extremely shallow. It doesn't allow you to talk about, that there are some, bourgeois Irish people who have some terrible viewpoints, and so on. They may even be bourgeois Irish people who are pro-English, for God's sake. Who knows? I don't even know. I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised. So one has to always take a class perspective, particularly you come from the kind of background we come from. You must always be pretty sharp about that, in my opinion. We talk about the media. I mean, I started off working in a television station in India, which is now one of the biggest channels in India, New Delhi Television, NDTV. It's the biggest channel. It's now owned by Mr. Adani, who is Modi's plutocrat. I started as a TV journalist, used to do street reporting. Then I went to a right-wing newspaper called The Pioneer. I worked there as the city reporter for Delhi, covered metropolitan issues and so on. I've been through a lot of newspapers. I know what they are like. I mean, it's no joke. He who pays the piper calls the tune. It's no joke. There are always cracks. The reason I love being a foreign correspondent is nobody cared what I wrote from Iraq. For the Hindu newspaper in Madras, I would write all kinds of crazy. I was much more to the left of any newspaper in the West, but I was writing for India's biggest newspaper. Why? Because my editor didn't give two shits what I wrote about. The Americans are killing civilians. They were like, oh, okay, fine. Run that on page 1 today. The Americans kill civilians. I mean, you'd never get that in the New York Times, for instance. I covered the 2014 attack on Gaza. I wrote, this is barbaric. Those kind of words it's horrific, barbaric. The editor didn't even read my copy. They just ran it because they were happy to have a reporter on the ground, as it were. So media is part of our struggle. It's in one. I don't look at the Guardian coming out of London and saying, well, it's a center-left newspaper. I think of all these papers as shit. And then I think, which are the individual journalists who are trying to do one or other little thing in them? Take the Irish Times, okay? The Irish Times, shit, agree. But sometimes there's a journalist here and there. Okay, one of my favorite journalists was a great Irish lion. He roared like an Irish lion. There are no lions in Ireland, but he was a lion, and that's Robert Fisk. Fisk worked for a mainstream newspaper. Fisky was a mainstream journalist, yeah? He was not, didn't have some little website somewhere. And Fisky and people like that, they were hardcore, man. I mean, he's one of the best foreign reporters in Beirut that I could even imagine seeing, yeah? Then the Coburn brothers, also Irish, Patrick and Alex, at least the two of them. Patrick was terrific in Iraq, a great mentor to younger journalists, So, I mean, it's a struggle for us inside the profession, you got to find the people, you got to build them up, you got to invite them to give talks, build their reputation, make the editors tremble when they walk into the building, help give these reporters some power. Our mass base should give the few left of center reporters in the mainstream some political power to get their views out there. And also, we should support left-wing media. I mean, don't be seduced into giving money to some piece of shit newspaper. Support independent media. Support the media I work for. I mean, I can't tell you what, because that goes against the rules of lecture series like this, but find out about it, and give us your billions of euros. Who knows, amongst you, one of you might have an old, allotment somewhere, so many acres of land.
Dream on. So,
Come on,
yes, right, Vijay, I'm under pressure to end you. I think it's fairly safe to say on behalf of everybody here, we could have stayed here all night. You only touched the surface, but you dealt with every issue comprehensively. You did a tour of the globe. I'm not saying you answered every question, but you certainly did your best and you touched on them all, and all of the information you gave us was incredibly relevant. So on behalf of the Desmond Greaves Summer School, even though it's nearly winter, we'd like to sincerely thank you for giving up your time. I want to remind you that Mick Wallace did text you about coming on to our podcast and you didn't reply, but that's a separate But we'll deal with that afterwards, but still, we're very grateful that you're here. We really we're going to move into the next part of the session, but as always, we're so grateful. You've been an enormous contributor to the anti-imperialist left in Ireland, and we look forward to seeing you in person again. You are released from your duties. Thank you very much. We're not yet over, and everything is under control. The time scale was well monitored and activated, because we do have another part to the agenda today, and that is a brief period, but we're absolutely delighted with it, that we have with us Dr Ruan O'Donnell. He's a senior lecturer in the University of Limerick, head of the history department, served as a visiting chair of Irish Studies at Notre Dame University. He has written countless books and articles in journals like the Irish Times and so on. We'll forgive you about that one. But in any case, his books are incredibly impressive. From Robert Emmet and the Rising of 1803, special category, the IRA in English prisons, biography of Pearse as part of the 16 series, on it goes. And he's here today, and we're so glad that he is, and we want you all to buy it or look it up, to say a few words to launch the new edition of the Desmond Greaves book, Mellows and the Irish Revolution, which Ruan has done an introduction to, and where there's a preface from Jerry Adams. So we're absolutely delighted that you're here, Ruan. Thank you so much.
For a proper analysis of that great man's life. Suffice to say that this is really in some ways a homage to the legacy of Desmond Greaves. And I very narrowly, sadly, and to my mind poignantly, missed out on meeting Desmond Greaves. But I've had the privilege of meeting many of his closest comrades. He's in a circle from the Congress Association days in the UK, and those who came back to form the backbone of what we're doing right now. And the reach of that circle is not fully appreciated as yet in our historiography. But it's something that many of those who participated, I hope can fill out some of the picture. Now there's some very good news here. Greaves was a meticulous archivist, memorialist, diarist. His personal archive, which is currently under the benign control of my dear friend Tony Coughlin, Professor Coughlin of Trinity Emeritus, is extraordinary. It is millions of documents. No, I don't say that, millions of words and hundreds of thousands of documents. It's extraordinary. He reminds me of Roger Casement by Squared, right? Roger Casement spent his whole life writing letters. Greaves must have been writing for hours of a day, every day. And what a contribution that man made to common decency in the struggle for, basically equanimity for the people who were prevented from having decent lives in the United Kingdom and Ireland. He was extremely progressive on the national question, to put it mildly, had a major impact on the strategy and the tactics of the civil rights movement, and rarely put a foot wrong, in my personal opinion. And if I'm wrong about that, I might well be wrong. None of us are angels, certainly not me. But Greaves was rarely, in my opinion, on the wrong side of history. And Jesus Christ, if you believe in such things, this is a time to be on the right side of history. Because things of shocking tenor and import are happening. So, very briefly, Greaves was extremely productive in terms of his polemics, his editorship of the Irish Democrat, his leading role in the Colony Association, a supporter of trade union movement, of a Labour Party when there was such a thing in these islands on both sides of the Irish Sea. I don't see any trace. I hope I'm not being obnoxious here. But let's just say we could do with a proper Labour Party in these islands, and in many and all the four countries of these islands, and abroad too. Now, that's just my particular broadcast. I'm finished with that. Don't worry, I'm not here to do that. I'm not a member of any party myself for the reasons that are bloody obvious. Greaves was he's a highly educated man who was also a spare time an autodidact. He knew everything about everything. He was something else. I mean, what am I? He's crying out for a proper contextualized biography, by the way. And I don't feel I'd be the best person to write it. If I felt that I was, I would do it. But I don't think I'm the best person for it. His voluminous output and his dedication to come from a man of Irish heritage, very significant Irish and Welsh heritage, in Rockferry, Birkenhead, the greater Liverpool area, a place with astounding ties to this country, then and now, and ongoing, hopefully. He took the difficult path to stand up and be counted, and to do things in his own time that made a damn difference in terms of drafting bills of rights, in terms of influencing Labour Party government, after the horrendous misstep in empowering fascistic elements of unionism in the North, as opposed to legitimate pro-British and Pearce analysis, which I personally oppose. But that's not the point. This book, I think, is his finest single work. Many of those who have read it would probably agree with me, but many would not. It was part of a conceptualization of how would someone document in living memory the cataclysm of the lockout, of the rising, of the war for independence and the Civil War. And a man who straddled all those things was Liam Mellows. Shot to death by his so-called friends on the 8th of December 1922. Shamefully. This is Ireland's stain. We never got over it. I don't even know how to talk about it without getting emotional and angry. So this is probably not a good night for that. He started off prioritising the extraordinary legacy of James Connolly. Another man who needs no introduction in this audience. And like Mellows, an Irishman who could claim to be a Briton by virtue of circumstance and happenstance and legacy. the Edinburgh connection, the Monaghan aspect, the Wicklow aspect, and the case of Greaves, the Greater Manchester area, very Irish city, and indeed Wexford, where he grew up with the Jordans of Inch and Castletown. The thing that I admire about Greaves in particular as a historian, I have the great privilege, it's an enormous gift in life for me to do something that's not a job. I don't even want the bloody money. I need the money to buy a house for my kids. Right? So I need the money, but I don't want to be paid. It's a privileged lifestyle. I've done my best to live up to the concepts of people like this man. Mellows could have done anything. He was on a red carpet to become a commissioned officer in the Imperial Army, which would have been a good way to live in those days. Not necessarily ethical or moral, but a very, a steadfast pathway to I suppose, a quiet life. You'd have to go off to Africa and India and do mean things to people who you insist are part of your empire. There's a price for that, but many people did it. My own family were in the IRA and the Royal Dublin Fusiliers. As I said before, a long line of military and paramilitary in my bloodlines, and indeed those of my wife and other extended members of my family. Greaves walked the ground. Whenever he could, he would literally walk the ground, or cycle, or hike, or commute. People like the late Roy Johnson, a member of our fraternity as such, or this committee of ours, I don't mean that in a gender sense, I mean it in a sense of camaraderie, helped him in his early trips to Ireland. He knew Ireland well. He transited frequently from Liverpool to London, where he was headquartered politically. He visited every archive open to him in the 1950s and 60s, and he actually lectured in Dublin in the 1940s, by the way, at which point he was representing the issues of the Communist Party of Great Britain. So Greaves always came to the front door. You know who you're talking about. You know who you're looking at when you're dealing with Greaves. So the prioritisation of the Connolly book was immensely important. And the Connolly book came out in 1961, just before the Dump Armours, the ceasefire order, written predominantly by Rudy O'Brady, shut down what we know colloquially as the Borders Campaign. Now that's a misnomer, and the 1950s campaign is also wrong. But I think you know what I'm talking about, right? So the Connolly book was well received, because Connolly was deemed to be a long dead, no longer dangerous to society socialist. In 1971, when this book came out in its first incarnation, there's a whole different thing. Because absolutely Mellows has socialist inflection. Absolutely, it's obvious from his writings. Just read what he said, and there's no better place to find it than this. There's some other more recent books that are very, very helpful indeed, by the way. That's not the point. But he was absolutely a revolutionary Republican. He was a Fenian. He was literally a Fenian. He came to the ranks of Fianna Éireann into Ogna Éireann as a Fenian. So he's a member of the deeper level of the Republican movement and an internationalist. He was exceptionally dangerous. No wonder they picked him out. When we talk about the allusions to Harry Boland and others, other lost leaders, Mellows was a deep loss. Now Greaves was researching at a time when the public archive was depleted by censorship, staffing, convenience, all of that. And it is true to say, and I have to acknowledge this, if you're going to be a little bit old-fashioned about academia and citations, it is a shame that he didn't use more footnoting in this, more citations. I'm serious about that. That is a shame, because it gave his opponents, who did not want the vision of people like Greaves and those who fought against the treaty, to have any purchase and skin in the game in terms of the outworkings of that bloody disaster, which is still haunting us today, albeit not on, thank God, at such a high level. Mellows was an absolute subversive. Absolute. He was. I would infer that man did not have a shred of fear in his body. Frank,
just
okay.
Is it true that Mellows damaged his own health by refusing to spend his
yes.
allotment for feeding himself? He didn't want to spend the money of the Republic on some trivial matter.
There was a big issue about that, because the allegation was that John Devoy's circle of Clan Gale had neglected him.
Yeah.
That wasn't true. But these things are damaging when you have end of campaign type internal politics.
Yeah.
Okay. We can talk about that again.
Or,
Suffice to say that in 1971, we were on the cusp of Bloody Sunday, but we already endured the planning for internment. Now, when you see internment without trial, that's a time when you know the British Empire have decided yet again to venture an option of violent capacity, which is unnecessary. And that, of course, we only don't talk about internment, in my opinion, because it's superseded by the mortal wounding of 14 people and the shooting of many more in Derry in January of '72. So internment was extremely important. And the international Irish community, including those in the United States of America, where Mellows had engaged successfully and unsuccessfully with that immensely important support base, they were very well aware of this. So there's not really going to be a civil rights option in real terms in the short term after August 1971. So when this book came out, the Morning Star dutifully and correctly gave it a very fine endorsement. The official global movement gave it a very fine endorsement, and the Nation Provisionals from December '69 and their friends like Punchlet like Engelsler and people of that nature also received it well, because they could see this isn't just about 1916 to 22. This is about 1971 looking into 72. All the underlying issues were relevant. It was immensely significant. Now, of course, the context has changed. I'm not arguing that point. I'm really trying to say that Greaves had his finger on the pulse, and most people were afraid of that. It didn't sell very well. It did not get a huge reception in the UK because people were worried by the implications of what it was saying. Now, Mellows met to compensate, and maybe because of the lack of access to things like the Bureau of Military History documents and the military service pension files, which thankfully now, due to the 26 counties, are largely available. And that's a very strong positive, and I endorse that. Maybe because of the lack of archive, he had to go and meet people. He met everyone. Anyone who would meet him, he'd go and see them over a period of years. He really got going sort of heavily in the early 1960s. At his very long gestation, and Greaves himself, we know from his own personal writings, regard this as his finest work. And it is a very mature, expert analysis of a terribly different topic, which had barely been touched by no one involved in the curriculum and no one in the university sector. I mean, where are the books of the Civil War of my childhood? It's people like the very brave Owen Neeson and Tim Cougar. Like these are civil servants and Fianna Fáil guys. And fine, and thank God for them. But I mean, there was no attempt for anyone to look at this terribly difficult issue because it divides us so much. Now, the thing that went unnoticed was the extent to which Greaves accessed private papers from those who had them from the Anti-Treaty Act perspective, which I know is not the only perspective of these things. And he reproduced a lot of them. That was not the typical way of doing a book like this. And I'm going to finish off in a second. I'm just reading very, very briefly, which is chapter 21. My dearest mother, the time is short, and much that I would like to say must go unsaid. There'd been a problem with family. But you will understand in such moments, heart speaks to heart. At 3:30 this morning, we, Dick Barrett, Roy O'Connor, Joe McKelvey and I, were informed that we were to be executed as reprisal. Welcome be the will of God for Ireland in his keeping despite foreign monarchs and treaties. Though unworthy of the greatest human honour that can be paid an Irishman or woman, 16th Proclamation, I go to join Tone and Emmett, the Fenians, Tom Clark, Connolly, Pearce, Kevin Barry and Childers. My last thoughts will be on God and Ireland and you. Now, if you're reading that in 1971, there's a 99% chance you've never seen it before anywhere. You've never heard it. This is the hidden Ireland. This is a revolutionary who's going to be executed within 5 hours with his comrades from Ulster, Munster, Leinster and Connaught. And in all cases, the most senior member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood in each of those provinces. Not a mistake. It's the same campaign that killed Childers, that murdered Boland. These are decisive blows against the motive force of the Irish revolutionary movement at a time of reaction, which became even more reactive in the late 1920s and 1930s. But that's for another time. So suffice it to say that I'm very honoured to be involved in getting a new edition of this book back in print. Fair dues to Lawrence Wishart. I have to acknowledge the extremely significant role of Tony Coughlin, which was decisive. He's the most ferocious proofreader I've ever encountered in 57 years of life, and we need that. The rigour must be there. I'm not going to tell you a lie. A couple of things crept in at the proof stage element that were problematic, but if you could find them, write to me on a postcard, and I'll get our friends in London to apologise. This is the best effort we could do. It's quite generously available for those who want it. There's actually not a lot of copies. At the moment, there's only 300 copies in the world, and many of them are already sold. So it's going to become quite hard to get quite soon. I'm not trying to sell you books. You can go to the damn library. Soon enough, because of the arrangements that we've made through the committee, you're going to be downloaded freely in the near future. That's not the point. Many of you might like to get it. If you don't want to get it, that's fine. But here's one thing I do ask you. If you haven't already read it, when you have a moment, suitable to your own private lives, please do. Nothing to do with our edition. This is an important book. And unfortunately, I hate to say, it is still relevant today. So thank you.
I don't need to encourage you to get that book. Ruan has already done that. That was an absolutely fantastic and fitting ending of the opening night of this school. What just insightful and strong and fitting tribute to Desmond Greaves, and highlighting the importance of the book. So can I thank Ruan, can I encourage you all to buy it, and remind you that you're here in the morning at 11 o'clock. So thank you so much everybody for coming. Thanks to the organisers, thanks to Ruan and Vijay of course as well. And back here bright and early, 11 o'clock in the morning.